Well, welcome everyone. This is Stan Price. I'm with the Smart Building Center, and thank you for joining what I think is going to be a really dynamic conversation about a data-driven approach to indoor environmental quality. And because of that, we'll certainly be talking about COVID-related occupancy issues going forward. So we have a great panel that we've put together. Like all of the sessions in this conference, we've designed them to be more interactive discussions rather than a series of PowerPoint presentations. So we'll be going through, after some brief introductions, a series of questions. You are certainly free to ask questions of this panel through the Q&A dialog box. That's the one we'll be monitoring. Also, feel free to put stuff into the chat box. You may get different experiences from others of our participants through chat, and you're welcome to do so. But we'll pay a little more closer attention to the Q&A dialog box. So with that, I want to welcome our panel here today. Aaron and Ron and Stephanie and Erik have graciously agreed to give us their time to have this conversation. And I can think of no better way to start this off than to ask each of them, and I'll ask Aaron to start, to just do a short introduction and tell us a little bit about what drove you to a career dealing with these kinds of issues.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining. Appreciate you taking the time with us. So I'm probably an odd one to start because I don't really consider myself an indoor air quality expert per se. Generally speaking, I work in high performance buildings and what people call smart buildings. Obviously the theme of this conference. I've been working around real estate, building systems and controlled mechanical systems for 17 years. Spent some time as a management consultant working in data-driven real estate transformations primarily. And I've been actually working almost exclusively in building technology and smart building programs for about the past 8 years. I worked previously for Cushman & Wakefield and built and ran a group in their technology team called the Digital Buildings Practice. And then I left last November and I'm now running my own consulting practice called System 2. So we really focus on 3 drivers in the built environment. Building performance defined as health and wellness of occupants, the experience of people within the building, which is a sort of broad defined term, and then of course the operational efficiency of the building. And obviously over the past almost 2 years now, there's been a major driver to push towards the health and safety aspects of building technology, and indoor air quality has become a major initiative with basically all of the clients I'm dealing with.
Great, thanks Aaron, and welcome. Stephanie, how about you?
So it's funny that you said that, Aaron, because I also don't consider myself an indoor air quality professional. I am a physician, so I'm passionate about the human body and human health and how we respond to our environment. But rather than me just tell you, I'd just like to show you a couple slides that really illustrate my journey much better than I can articulate it. So if you'll bear with me. So the question that I will tell you again in about very few seconds is, how did I get from Harvard Medical School over here on the left to Building for Health? It was through the realization that buildings truly are, in my opinion, our best medicine. So my journey started when I was in medical school. So yes, that is me before my hair turned gray. I went to Papua New Guinea as a medical student to have an adventure. And I worked in this hospital called the Wewak General Hospital. If you look at these images, you can see that the surface hygiene, looks a little different from what you're probably used to if you hang out in US hospitals, which I hope you don't have to. But so I went to New Guinea and I saw these conditions and I kept a very careful journal, and the patients did very well. They didn't get extra infections. They went home when we thought they would. So I come back to Boston, to the Harvard system, to these beautiful rooms and these beautiful hospitals. And I realized that over the next several years, that infections from the hospital environment are a leading cause of death. And as I watched these trends, I saw certain sort of segregation within hospitals, like certain organisms and certain physical locations. So I tried to talk to my physician colleagues about this, and they said, just give the right antibiotics. That's all you can do. I tried to talk with the building folks, and I didn't understand anything they said, and I don't think they understood what I was saying. So I decided I needed to get my master's in architecture so I could really relate to this. So I went back to school in my late 40s, got a master's in architecture, and designed hospitals for some years. And in my real aha moment came doing this study, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, I promise. But I was wondering still about these infections in the hospital. So I was working with infection control folks, and we were doing Petri dish swabs and ATPase wipes and sort of the common metrics to assess the building. And it occurred to me, why don't we use the most important metric that's in the patient room? It's like the Petri dish in the bed. In other words, the patient. So in this study, we monitored this hospital for a year, all the things you see listed in the middle. And then we correlated them with patient infections. And so I thought, it would be hand hygiene or visitors or one of the things that, we kind of might predict. Lo and behold, our results came back saying that when the indoor relative humidity was low, there were significantly more infections, and that this was an independent variable. So I didn't believe the statistician. We fired them, said, could you please tell us sort of more what we expected? And they thought, you guys are hard-headed. But again, this trend has been found again and again and again, that low relative humidity is associated with more infections. And I tell you this, not just about relative humidity, but because it was a total surprise. And it made me realize that using a health lens to assess buildings is very, very different from energy metrics or from individual particles or VOCs or CO2. So that led me to where I am today, which is the need to scale this approach. And so what I'm doing 30 hours a day, like everyone else here, I'm sure, is we've created this, this health impact rating. So we assess the 10 metrics that are key to human physiology, both individually and looking at the reactive chemistry of those indoor air components. We evaluate the data, continuous real time through our health algorithm, which looks at all of the functions of the human body. And we create a real time health impact rating. And the thing that's super cool about this is that you get one score, but then you can take it apart. You can dissect the score, and you will see that it's not only individual components, but it's also the reactive chemistry of those components. And the beauty of looking at the interactions of things is that you can, if you do need to remediate your building, you don't just have one choice. So for example, we don't say you need to humidify your building. And if you're in Alaska in the winter, you'll say, yeah, no. But because we look at interactions, it gives you a variety of remediation steps. And we've also found that a lot of buildings are just absolutely fantastic and don't need remediation. But anyway, so that's my journey, and thank you.
Great. Fascinating, Stephanie. And later on, I think we want to turn back to this question, the role the ratings can play in terms of moving this discipline forward. But Erik, can we turn to you now, and same question, give us a little introduction and kind of how you got where you are.
Sure. Thanks so much. So while Aaron and Stephanie both want to claim that they don't have an indoor air quality background, I think I can claim that myself, because I am really coming into this as an outsider. So my background is lots of other things, including agriculture and international development. I'm an Army veteran, but I lead SafeTraces, a Bay Area-based safety technology company that has its roots in biosecurity. And our technology, which is at its core a kind of DNA tagging technology, is able to create surrogate particles that safely mimic pathogens, and they can be foodborne pathogens. They can also be airborne pathogens. And our technology was originally conceived at a time where the US had bioterror threats for things like anthrax spores, and the government wanted to mimic that type of attack hitting public spaces within the US, and being able to understand where are those particles traveling to, where are they creating exposure risks, and how well are our defenses performing. And our company was spun out of Lawrence Livermore 2015. And actually, we spent the past, or prior to the pandemic, we focused on foodborne pathogens, and we're very focused on validating safety in food processing plants. When the pandemic hit, and we quickly realized that that COVID was transmitted through the air and was aerosol based, we realized that number one, our technology was immediately relevant. And number two, as we started digging into how are buildings actually testing safety and how well their ventilation is performing, we quickly realized that in many cases they weren't, and for a pathogenic type risk. And then secondly, to the extent they were using a lot of proxies like CO2 and other particle challenges. And our basic animating idea was, well, what if you could safely simulate respiratory emissions in buildings, and you could track where that particulate was traveling? That would be very powerful. And so we took out our technology to the market with some initial customers who immediately bid on this. And then over the past year and a half, we've quickly gotten significant traction, basically addressing a major gap in the diagnostic market of how are you testing real world buildings for, sick people emitting airborne pathogens. And it's been an amazing run. We're now working nationally and soon internationally. And so we're coming at this basically trying to just tell people who are trying to figure out, how do I reopen my building? How do you know if our HVAC is performing well? Where would we want to spend more money? All those types of very practical questions. We give them data to basically answer those questions. So it's been a fascinating run. But that's it, and grateful for the opportunity to speak with this group today.
Thanks, Erik. So Ron, I'm going to turn to you for the same thing, in the fervent hope that you will be the one panelist who say that you were born to be in this field.
However, you three guys find a way to say you guys are not experts. I'm just honored to share the same time and space with these three experts and the audience. So my journey to where I am right now, I'm the co-founder and the chief commercial officer for Awair, where I lead partnerships and business development opportunities for the company. When we first started Awair, my co-founder and I kind of shared the same problems. So we had children that had, and still to this day, suffer respiratory and skin issues when they were born. So my kids typically shared skin disease, eczema, and my co-founder's kids have had asthma. And we found both of us trying to figure out a good way to understand what we need in our homes. There are multiple things we could do, whether we do ventilation correctly at the right timing and right amount, humidification or dehumidification or purification. We were just kind of asking friends and family around us on what they have done with a similar situation. And we just kind of came back to the situation of, we really don't know what we have on our hands when it comes to our homes. So that's how we started Awair, and fast forward, we're building a network of indoor air quality monitors that could really help our clients, whether it be consumers or commercial building owners and occupants, to understand the baseline and help them share information between, let's say, owners and tenants employees and employers to really achieve the right level of transparency and get to the right solution and in a sustainable manner. So that's where I'm coming from, and looking forward to a good conversation going forward.
Great. Thanks to you all. This is going to be a good conversation. And Stephanie, I want to start with you. The rules of engagement for this discussion are that I'm going to ask one of the panelists to jump in first to a question, but completely open the floor for everybody else to chime in and with their own perspective or to ask additional questions. But Stephanie, as you described, you're uniquely qualified. In fact, you are the first and only physician architect that I've ever known. And so you are uniquely qualified to talk about this issue of how human health is affected by the built environment. And you alluded to that certainly in your introduction. And I'm interested in you expanding on that idea. But specifically, I have always wondered about the challenge of whether explicitly or implicitly creating monetary value for these human health effects and the improvement of human health in relationship to the built environment, and whether or not that sort of monetization is critical in order to get the kinds of actions out of the people who own and manage and operate our commercial and institutional building space. So that's a big, broad question. Answer any component of that you like.
It's interesting, Stan. I saw that question up front in the list and I thought, wow, that's a bold way to start. But in reality, it's also probably the most powerful driver of any change is, can you monetize it? And the answer to the first part of the question, which was, do buildings affect our health? I mean, we're indoors 90% of the time, as you all know. And if you think about the forces on our body, on our skin, our lungs, our cells, and the indoor environment is incredibly powerful at governing our immune system, as Ron is talking about with his children. Cognitive functioning, organ functioning, cancer, proliferation of the cells. So it's more important than I ever knew, and they didn't teach us this in medical school either. Then your next question about how do you monetize the benefits of improving the indoor environment for human health? And it's funny you say that, because I spent the morning working with one of my colleagues who's an MIT Harvard Med School professor who has done a lot of research and writing about pandemic preparedness and the economic benefits of non-pharmacological interventions. This is before COVID. So there are a number of ways of monetizing human health. And yes, you can do it. There's cost avoidance of medical procedures, acute and chronic. That is a little bit, a few steps away from most of our lives, thankfully. But then you can also look at the effect of schoolroom indoor air quality on student performance. Not just student performance theoretically, but again, I just wrote a paper on this. Public schools K through 12 actually receive funding based on in-house standardized tests. And if the students don't meet certain criteria, for 3 years, federal funding is actually diminished. So one of the co-founders of Building for Health was telling me today that his state, the governor decided just to take away those tests. The problem with that is that after 5 years of no testing, your federal funding is again dramatically decreased. So schools, you can monetize it. Commercial office buildings, there are good reports on productivity and absenteeism as it relates to the indoor environment. Senior living facilities is actually one of our early customers. You can decrease transfers to acute care hospitals because of infections. You can decrease bed turnover, which then relates to nursing staff retention. So it's a little bit more, it's not as easy as reading your energy bill and writing a check, but it's very doable.
Great. Yeah, I wasn't aware of the federal funding tied to the standardized testing. That is a very interesting point. And To follow up, certainly Ron or Erik or Aaron, all of you have companies that are trying to motivate the folks who make these sorts of decisions that control certainly commercial and institutional space in their building environments. How are you finding the challenge of communicating that value to your potential customers in relationship to making these necessary investments? Any one of you?
So I'm happy to kick off. To start, it's a very interesting dynamic. We come, with deep roots in kind of the food industry and food safety, and there are much more onerous compliance requirements put on food processing plants, and then also even, consumer facing restaurants and so forth. When you come into the built environment, it's kind of very surprising how light the safety requirements and compliance are. And so it really puts you and given that, although that seems to be changing right now and the pandemic is prompting that, you're really relying on people to kind of self-police and see it in their interests and prove out ROI to make for them to take this issue seriously. And I think that our experience has been when there's in owner occupier spaces where a company's own employees are in the space and they want them to be in the space performing, being productive, doing work that needs to happen in the space or more productive, then it becomes an easier argument to make to them because they can run they have their own calculations, and many have already been investing in indoor air quality, indoor environmental quality, and healthy buildings. Whereas if you're in a commercial real estate with an owner and then a property manager and then the tenants, you have much more split incentives. And that's where it's more challenging and where a lot of that market is not as motivated or there's not as much alignment. And so, but now I think the pandemic is an extreme case where people are kind of now they're waiting out in some cases. When are we going to get people back into buildings? And the vaccine was supposed to be the silver bullet, but that is proving to be not the silver bullet, and this thing is dragging on. And I think the more that you see vacancies or concern about vacancies and property values changing and so forth, then it's going to start striking more fear into people that they need to do something about it. So you have the kind of bleeding edge that gets it, and then a lot of the rest of the market that is it's going to be how much pain will they have to endure, and then when is the regulatory hammer going to drop, which I think could really change things. So I think that's been, and we've been living through that experience ourselves. So that's my perspective on that. But turn it over to Aaron and Ron.
I'll hit it from a different angle. So when I say I'm not a pure IAQ expert, as Erik pointed out, I'm probably lying a little bit. I'm a professional engineer. I've designed a lot of buildings. I've also worked in optimizing operating buildings for, like the lab, basically dedicated to that field for 7 or 8 years or so. And so I have seen I know a lot about ventilation, and I've seen a lot of what is done and what comes out the other side of that. And the biggest area where I think I'm afraid that we're going to need improvement in the long run is with the engineering community. So, the MEP engineering community and the reliance upon ASHRAE standards as sort of gospel for what they do is starting to prove problematic when it comes to indoor air quality. It, I think, is really good on the energy side. ASHRAE 90.1, the energy standard is steadily moving forward and making things tougher on manufacturers and working as essentially like an emission standard, almost setting the sort of mileage limits for the original equipment manufacturers. And I think LEED has done a lot in that respect too. But even the LEED indoor environmental quality credit, the sort of best in classes, dropped 30% onto ASHRAE 62.1. 62.1 needs to catch up. And look, I've seen arguments on Twitter and arguments on LinkedIn about this that entirely miss the point. And these are the people that are making these standards within these bodies. And they'll basically say, ASHRAE 62.1 is not meant to show best-in-class ventilation. Why are you all using it? And yet every engineer that's designing buildings is using ASHRAE 62.1 as the Bible for what you're supposed to do for ventilation. And if there's any sort of uncertainty about that, let me dispel that for you. They are, right? Everyone is using that standard, and they're pulling the number right out of those tables or right out of those simple ventilation equations, and they're using it unless they have a good reason not to. And frankly, it's just not enough. It doesn't result in the right kind of outcomes for health and safety or productivity or just sort of general wellness variables. So I think changing that mindset and getting engineers to sort of model and understand the data around IAQ in the way that they do around energy is the real challenge of sort of my chosen field for the next 10 years. It's to shift and incorporate both. And then I'm sure, as we'll talk about in the future or in the conversation coming up, it's the sort of trade-off between energy and sustainability and how to think about that and blunt that trade-off so that we're not just pretending that this is, giving people healthy indoor environments is going to completely blow away the idea of sustainability, which I certainly hear again and read on arguments on Twitter related to this topic. So that's my sales challenge, right? Is sell the engineering community on how to do ventilation better.
Well, Ron, I'd like to actually spring off of that and ask you to open a discussion about the question of what data do we need? What are the right proxies that we should be getting for evaluating indoor air quality? Stephanie opened up talking about the work that she had done, looking at the role that relative humidity had played in relationship to infection control in hospital, but now opening that up more broadly. From your perspective, what data do we need? What are the right things for us to capture in order to get a better understanding about improving or maintaining indoor air quality?
Sure. So kind of a sales challenge conversation that Aaron ended his comments on, and kind of leading up to your question for the data sets we need. We're certainly seeing the challenge of our potential clients, our also clients, playing a bit of a more of a defense than offense. And what I mean by that is a lot of times you feel like you have all the tools and standards to fit your building to. However, you may not have a good understanding of where your building is, like how building is built, where the building is located. Every building has its own story, kind of, right? The amount of ventilation they would need, the different kinds of thermal comfort and control they would need, and even floor by floor. So we talk a lot about the baseline. Let's understand the baseline. In fact, when we are talking about COVID and potentially bringing folks back, and nobody knows when, fully in occupancy, if the building is empty, that's the perfect time to understand the baseline. How your ventilation is working. Is there any kind of off-gassing objects that we may not know of, carpets and paints, for example. So understanding the baseline, including the CO2 for ventilation, obviously, and that's becoming a huge conversation around COVID-related indoor health and safety protocols. And then particulate matter, there's a lot of conversation around how particulate matter in the air and air pollution in general can impact the transmission of COVID-like viruses and pathogens. So really understanding the baseline, not necessarily like 5 to 7 specific components of indoor air quality, but understanding your building and space first, and putting the right resources to do so, kind of playing offense, and then really getting to the root of what those important components are going to be for your building and your properties. if you're owner of multiple buildings, your portfolio, right? And each building may present different kind of challenges. So getting to that really good baseline to work off of, that would be, our first recommendation.
So can I say something here?
Absolutely.
So a couple of things. One, Aaron, I work a lot with ASHRAE, Epidemic Task Force, Environment Health Committee, and I'm sometimes frustrated by the slowness of how it pivots. But try talking to physicians about environmental health, and you will feel much better about engineers. So I think engineers are amazing, And when I talk to ASHRAE says we're not in the business of testing and balancing humans. At least that's what they used to say. But that attitude has really pivoted. So the other thing I wanted to say in response to you, Ron, is that one of the things that's fascinating is not only looking at those, in my opinion and experience, is not only looking at the individual components, but how they interact. And so, for example, NO2 and ozone in the presence of human beings, because we emit skin flakes that have squalene, which is so the reactive chemistry indoors is really fascinating and very impactful. And so if you think about your membranes, you have water in your respiratory system, you have lipids in your skin, and when you get polar and non-polar compounds combining, it has a very different transmission pathway into the body. So I think it's key not only to look at these individual metrics, but to look at how the interaction of them actually affects our ability to not only function when we're healthy, but also how do the interacting chemicals affect our immune system. So it's such a rich and exciting and sometimes complicated topic, but there's so much to be gained. And I'm hoping that we can all work together, because everything I'm hearing from you guys is just, I'm like, oh, I want to work with him. I want to do that with him. It's amazing.
Collaboration, that is a key. Aaron or Erik, would you like to jump in here before the next question?
I'd like to quickly just give the boilerplate answer, if I can, of what the kind of standard measurements are. So there's sort of three types of data you care about when you care about indoor air quality. You care about what I call the environmental variables. If you want a good case of what those are, go to Awair's website, see what they monitor on the Omni, or go to the Reset website, the certification standard, but basically it's temperature, humidity, TVOCs, CO2, and particulate matter, usually PM 2.5. Those are the 5 things that generally you measure. Some of the sensors will also measure inorganic gases or things like radon that pose a different type of risk. Some throw in a carbon monoxide monitor, but those 5 are really the sort of core IAQ variables. Second type of data is health and safety data. So particularly understanding your virus risk, which you can do through a proxy with those other variables, but there's really not much out there on the market to do that other than what SafeTraces is doing, to be totally honest, that actually has scientific backing. So I would definitely look, to a testing solution like that, right? You can't actually measure the virus with a sensor right now. It requires a PCR test, just like if you go take a nasal swab COVID test, but you need a solution that actually does that with airborne pathogens, and SafeTraces is the one really doing that. And then the last thing that often gets forgotten, but I think is incredibly important, is understanding the health of your mechanical systems. So, ventilation and filtration are kind of the key controls to making IAQ better. You need to understand how your HVAC is working, and therefore you need a well-instrumented building automation system, or BMS, and you need to be doing automated fault detection and diagnostics, because there's a significant amount of data put out. Clockworks just recently made a blog post on this that explained how many zone level terminal units are broken across their entire installed base of hundreds of millions of square feet of HVAC globally, and it's north of 10%, right? And so if you're in the room with a broken VAV box that has a damper that's got a loose set screw and isn't adjusting its flow, then you may be not getting enough air to that room, and that's a huge risk. So those are the 3 types of data: environmental variables, health and safety data, and the health of your mechanical systems.
Great. Well, I want to, based on that comment, Aaron, which is great, all of you, all of this commentary is great. I want to take the questions a little bit, heads up, a little bit out of order here. Because I want to ask, and you made reference, Aaron, to the kinds of innovations that Erik has brought to the marketplace, but a little bit about how the SARS-2 virus has begun to change what we might call those traditional markers for indoor environmental quality, to which you gave a good catalog there. Erik, why don't you tell us a little bit about specifically what your approach has been from your company in relationship to looking at viral contamination in indoor environments?
Yes. So I thought Aaron did a great job kind of breaking it down into the different data sets from environmental health and safety, and then system performance, which is impacting both. We quickly realized that on the health and safety side, that was where there are some huge gaps. And to some extent, you can take the environmental data that was already, people are collecting and it's already part of the system. Arguably, we're not getting as much, extracting as much value out of that data, and use that as Aaron said, as proxies for airborne disease and virus. But they all have their drawbacks, whether you're talking about CO2 or PM 2.5 or other things. In a few respects, probably the most notable is that they're not aerosols. Aerosols are, in some ways behave as gases, but not exactly. And there's complexity, when you're talking about a respiratory emission of someone coughing, sneezing, breathing, talking, whatever, there's liquid aerosol particulate coming out of that person that is then generating, different size distributions. And then within those particles, there's either virus, or some other pathogenic material within those particles that then is the thing you're concerned about. And so part of the reason that health and safety has been, I'd say, kind of underinvested in and not well understood is a few things. Number one, the nature of the risk itself is very complex. It's like the material, the way that people actually get infected, and understanding the infectious dose and all that stuff is one. And then partly the air is complicated because it's uncontained. It's kind of going across spaces. It's not something as well defined as food or water or other classes of pathogens. And so you then you go into, kind of buildings which are unique, and air is constantly changing and dynamic and so forth. And it's something that without real focus and prioritization and research and funding, it's easy for us to not do anything about. And when you're talking about kind of pre-COVID, where people are getting sick with the flu and common cold, that's one issue. But now we're dealing with a kind of existential issue of we may not even be able to open buildings until we get a handle on this. So where we come in is we say, okay, we care about, we're firmly in the health and safety lane, and you need an aerosol, and you need an aerosol to not only safely simulate a respiratory emission, but then most importantly, you want to understand how the systems are removing that particulate from the air and being able to have field data. Not, the kind of gold standard is peer-reviewed research, but all of that is generally in controlled environments. And out in a real building, there's a lot of, air is not homogeneously distributed and mixed. There's all sorts of funky stuff happening, and there's a real need to test real buildings to understand what's going on, and not just test them once, but test them on an ongoing basis. So where we've come in is through our particle technology. We're trying to give you the safest kind of simulation or surrogate for a airborne aerosol particle with virus, and then being able to track where's it going, how, where is it creating exposure risks, and how are the systems taking that out of the air and doing that in buildings. So you can tell the facility manager, whoever's responsible for safety and spending, here's where you're at. And to Ron's point, it's important to baseline, but then where are you going to spend money? There's infinite strategies and things you can do. You want to figure out what's appropriate for your building, where there's going to be a real health and safety benefit, and also where the price tag makes sense and where you can prove ROI. So we're trying to be the enabler for that, to break into what I call the black box of buildings from a health and safety risk, figure out what's going on, and then help make better decisions. So that's where we've gotten, there was a big need for that, but it wasn't urgent until the pandemic. And now it's both urgent, and there's going to be a long tail, and that kind of people now more widely across the market, and not just within the engineering community and the health and safety community, but the general public understand that there's this risk out there within buildings. And we're already seeing that with all the concerns about workplace safety, which polls reflect is widespread. And already, in our anecdotal experience, employers are struggling to bring people back into the workplace without a high bar for them communicating what they're doing and that the building is safe. And so that's where the pressure is coming. And I think it's unfortunate is come out of this experience that has been very painful and costly for people, but it's something that needed to happen a long time ago.
Great. Thank you. And so in that regard, and Stephanie, I'd like for you to address this first, but I think everybody would have some perspective here. But I think sometimes the market tends to act without evidence. Have you seen examples of that in reaction to our current environment in relation to buildings and COVID?
Oh my gosh, absolutely, Stan. And I think, Erik, I just love everything you're saying, because I think in buildings, healthy human beings in buildings is a really hard thing to understand, because medicine is over here in one silo, building science is over here. Now we have the PCR analysis, so we can do the metagenomics of humans in the built environment, but it's hard to get data sets. And so in the absence of easily attainable data on health, people tend to just want to do something. So what I've seen and what our company has seen is exactly that. In some senior living facilities, they say people need for us to do something. And so they spent a lot of money on something. But then there were some questions about whether or not that something was the right thing to do. So they asked us to test before and after. And we found out that in one building, they didn't need anything at all because they were great. In another building, what they installed was actually making conditions worse given their, and Erik, I'm sorry, but I'm going to plagiarize that. Who said every building has its own story? That's brilliant, because every building is different. And so yes, in the absence of health data, people just want to do something. And it's understandable, but it's not ideal.
Ron, what's been your experience in terms of day-to-day out there working with building owners?
Building owners is one thing, so I'll get to that. And I wanted to share my story also with regard to our children. So just recently, schools opened up. I'm in the Bay Area, and all the schools pretty much have opened their buildings. And as much as I would like to work with them, and in the process working with the school district, I mean, just recently in California, we've seen a legislation, AB 841, passed with regards to funding to improve the ventilation functionality and tracking the CO2 levels of school buildings. It's been a struggle. And I could say I'm sending 2 of my kids to this school, and there's nothing in the building that would, make me feel comfortable of sending them. I think it's just, to be honest, it's just a matter of time that we have a positive case and we close down these school buildings, which is unfortunate because I think we had a lot of time, to be honest with you, throughout the last summer vacation to really come up with a plan for all the school buildings, not only in California, but obviously for the whole nation. And we see from our company perspective, this is a global trend. School buildings, when it comes to school buildings, governments and other organizations are trying to put together a plan to protect and improve the indoor health and safety of these school buildings. So I think that's one area that we could all work together to help these schools. And when it comes to owners and operators, we've worked together. There's a lot of conversation about segmenting the areas of their responsibility, the outdoor air, the induct air, namely core and shell, and then the supply of the air to tenants, and then the return of the air back to the system, right? So, trying to work with them in understanding and helping them have a plan to go about, okay, let's cover the core of the buildings first, and then find a way to work with tenants, whether it being a service provided by owners or a collaboration between owner and tenants. I think that's the conversation that a lot of owners are having, and we certainly have done so. However, I think it's very slow going, and it's going to take more time for bigger organizations when it comes to owners and REITs to have a comfortable level of how they might want to approach their properties, and then work with the tenants in sharing data and getting to the right solutions for each of their buildings. So that's kind of been my experience so far.
Yeah, Aaron, it seems to me then that at least in relationship to COVID, that there's this sort of short list of, increased system ventilation, better filtration and, kind of surface cleaning as being the ubiquitous strategies across the board. Is this the right list? Is that in fact a universal solvent to apply to all buildings to increase the increment of safety inside, or is that a sense of false security?
Yeah, I don't, unfortunately, because every building has its own story, it's very hard to make broad brush judgments on this. And, this is something where you actually totally understand why a group like ASHRAE and the Epidemic Task Force did what they did, because they're just trying to get people to make, the improvements that seem like they're going to have the biggest impact, right? And related to the scope of things that they think about. But that is a bit of a sledgehammer, and I think you're looking more like the job is more for like a scalpel, right? Or at least something in between. So I struggle with saying apply any major recommendation across the board. I mean, if you are in the Bay Area right now, depending on what day, now that the fire season, I just left the Bay Area. I lived there for 6.5 years. I'm in Texas now, but we left in the middle of hideous wildfire smoke last year. So it's hard to recommend that the broad brush solution for San Francisco is increase outside air. Now that you have a significantly elevated risk of wildfire smoke for 3 to 4 months out of the year. And wildfire season started in June. So they're starting to have the same problems that Beijing has had for a long time now, so we need to be careful about this. And this is where the 3 types of data that I talked about, I think, the sort of purpose of this panel was to talk about a data-driven approach. We have to have a data-driven approach to decision-making on this, right? And that's operational and capital decision-making. So you need to find, I think the first thing you should do if you're running a commercial building is find out the stuff that's broken on your system. And if you don't have a well-instrumented building automation system, you need to get it there. That's foundational to everything. Fix the stuff that's broken. That's hard enough problem. Then you need to do some combination of IAQ monitoring with sensor technology and health and safety testing in order to understand where the problem areas are if you truly want to improve. And really you need both, because you may have CO2 issues in conference rooms that are fully loaded. You may also find that you've got pressurization issues that you find, you know, from doing the aerosol-based testing. You basically need to understand more information about your building and then make your decisions from that. And it depends on what you want to do. And you do need to balance, obviously, sustainability. I mean, the thing I don't like about the broad recommendation of just increase outside air, and to some extent that applies to filtration too, but it's really bad with outside air in most climate zones, is there is an energy penalty with that. Now there's ways that you can sort of blunt that, but you know, at the same time you go to increased outside air, you make sure you have properly functioning outside air economizers installed. But I mean, at a certain point, you do hit a trade-off with that recommendation, and you need to think about the sustainability side of it too. So I would not recommend any kind of broad-based measures to anyone across the board. Put them in a toolkit of options you can select from and get the information you need to make the decision amongst those options. Erik said there's a million different things you can choose earlier. I actually put together a list of all the things an FM can do to improve IAQ, and there's basically 26 things that I could think of that they could do. So it's not a million. There's not that many, right? And outside air is one, and increasing filtration is another, and there's about 24 others, including things you probably aren't able to do, like limit occupancy, but that is a thing you could do to improve safety in a building, right? And so you need to be, what your goal is to choose amongst the 26 or however many options to make the building safer. And to do that, you need data.
I so totally agree with you, Aaron. And I think that from my perspective, we need the visibility that I think monitoring is key, because even when you ask Stan about surface hygiene, some of the protocols that are in place actually cause issues with, you know, material interactions with increased VOCs, you know, the whole field of the microbiome of the built environment, which is kind of moved aside during this SARS-CoV-2 time. But we don't want to be creating indoor environments through improper surface disinfection that actually select for more pathogenic organisms. And that's what a lot of disinfection strategies do. But I think from my perspective, the first thing we need is visibility into the true health impact of the indoor environment, because before you can choose from that list of 24 things, you need to know where you're going. You need to know what your health related baseline is. I think it's absolutely key.
Yeah, interesting. Well, this is a conference that's built around the idea that increasing the sort of smart and intelligent building operations will lead to greater efficiency and you know, flexibility and reliability and productivity and human health. So let me pose the question: if as buildings get smarter, will we see then a tendency towards better indoor environmental quality? Is that going to be a byproduct, just as I think I heard Aaron saying, is that when we increase the smart quotient, that's the pathway to get to a better indoor environment? And Erik, could you take a first shot at that?
Yes. So I think that probably smart is going to have to much more seriously consider health and safety as part of the smart equation. I think that the smart equation is, you know, already it's what it was trying to be smart about in terms of different systems and data sets talking to each other. In the old world, you know, pre-pandemic, was incredibly challenging in dealing with fragmentation and siloed kind of data stacks and systems and things that aren't integrated. And now you've just put another overlay on that I think is going to have to be dealt with. But that being said, I think there's no question that we see the need for that. And so now that just it becomes kind of like a bit of a ground campaign now of like, how do you actually bring in this new kind of filter into that thinking? And then how do you manage the tensions between them, especially on the energy cost, sustainability side of things, of which they're not irreconcilable, but there's certainly tensions. And I think what's required is ultimate flexibility within buildings and across buildings to be able to dial things up and down as the situations require. And that to me is really how I think about smart buildings. Being, admittedly a kind of newbie, is there's no one size fits all. And within a building, you may want to dial up the infection control knob when you're in the pandemic, but then you need to dial it down when you're in California and you've got wildfires. And so being able to then have systems and technologies and data that enable you to do those things, which is a massive undertaking, is kind of where it's at for the future. So
I agree. The goal of Doug Stewart is still at Cushman & Wakefield. It was my partner in the digital buildings practice. And I had this set of conversations that led us to the conclusion that the goal of smart buildings is to allow the building to operate in modes. So it's exactly what the conclusion Erik just came to there. That's really what it comes down to. You need to think about like the modal-based use cases, right? That you can organize into what the building is actually doing to either improve user experience, improve health, safety, and wellness, or improve operational efficiency, or become grid interactive, which you all had a panel on earlier, right? Like the building needs, the definition of smart is how well it moves between modes of operation, incorporating data. That's my metric, basically.
Well, I want to talk a little bit, and recognizing that, we have about 15 minutes left in our session or so, I want to get to sort of two aspects of the cultivating the right market conditions to make all this happen. First, I know that Ron and Erik and Aaron have been involved in putting together an industry group to help do some of that work called Aspire. And I'm going to ask you all just to tell us a little bit about what Aspire is and what you're trying to do by putting this association together, and then leaving some time for Stephanie to talk a little bit more in depth about the rating system that she's also working on and introduced into the market. So I think, Aaron, you may have a couple of slides to start off with your colleagues about Aspire.
Yeah, I'll share screen real quick. Yeah, so one of the things that our group at Cushman & Wakefield was doing was evaluating a lot of technology, and this is going back a few years, couple years. Pre-pandemic, we were thinking about indoor air quality as a key category of IoT, long before the first cases came through of COVID. And so that, along with the sort of building analytics space and green tech and all kinds of technology categories related to the built environment that we were evaluating, like all of their competitors do too. And essentially looking to be able to take solutions to clients, right? So we interacted with a lot of startups, a lot of big companies with new products. And when I left that world and started out with my own firm, I had a lot of good relationships in the space. I've been working with the people from Clockworks for a long time, since 2015. First we did a project together when I was at Switch Automation. And so really what kind of happened is we were all, several of us were talking bilaterally with each other, and I was talking with all of these companies, and then we found out we were talking to a lot of the same potential customers as well about the same topic of what to do with data and indoor air quality. We decided to pull together a group that is really an industry alliance, sort of marketing and advocacy and education alliance. It's similar in concept in a way to the Smart Building Center, much more nascent. We just founded in June, but our goal is to pull together to try to advocate and educate on the basics of a data-driven approach to indoor air quality, what we've been talking about today. So my company, System 2, SafeTraces, Awair, and then 2 other companies in Verit and Clockworks Analytics have pulled together as the original founding members of the group. We are looking to expand too, by the way. So if anyone is of interest, you know, we're sort of particular about staying within our lane here and not just becoming a broad-based, you know, equipment rep type organization. But if anyone's interested, let us know. We're also looking for buildings where we can deploy all the solutions in to make a really public case study of doing the kind of smart building approach to indoor air quality. And you know, just sort of explaining what we do. You know, we're really focused on information gaps, and then advocating for a strategy that's comprehensive, data-driven, you know, actually addresses sustainability and is ultimately practical for the real estate environment. Because so much of what comes out is academic, 50,000 foot or really detailed studies in a particular case and not broadly applicable to the real estate environment. Guys, anything else to say on that?
Just from my side, so I think that there is just tremendous, like, part of the problem, or part of the challenge, shall I say, that we're living in right now is that there are not clear, quantifiable standards. You know, we can, we all agree that buildings are unique and the risk is complex, but ultimately you have to put down some numbers and agree on what the way that you're measuring from a performance perspective, you know, risk or system performance. And I think that Aspire can really help drive that discussion. I think that given the kind of multifaceted nature of the risk, which is touching ASHRAE, but also CDC and OSHA and others, you know, ultimately you have to kind of look at it holistically and then put down, you know, something that defines, you know, different risk thresholds or performance thresholds. And I think with us kind of taking this approach of taking companies that are innovative and also living through this and kind of touching on these problems and also generating a lot of the data that you would need to kind of help quantify things, I think that it, you know, it's from our side been really helpful to help use this as a vehicle to partner up with like-minded people and help try to steer the public discussion in a productive way. So.
And just to add to that, it's rarely when we work with our owners and operators and tenants, clients, that they need just one thing. It's a lot of times, most of the times, they need a package of a solution to understand all the way from assessing it and then getting to a sustainable solution. So that's kind of our approach here.
Yep, agreed. And if you want to check us out, we've got a website up, aspireiaq.com. Got some content coming out, and we appreciate the support.
Great. Aaron, while I ask Stephanie a question, do you mind putting that in the chat box, that website address? Stephanie, there was a question came in actually from my good friend and colleague, Tom Marseille, that I think is in your wheelhouse and potentially related to your rating system. Though mysteriously his question just seemed to have disappeared from my screen, but that's okay. No problem. I'll paraphrase. These, as Aaron alluded to, these issues can be really complicated, and a lot of the information is very deep into technical papers, as it should be in terms of digging in and really finding out the answers. But for a lot of folks in the marketplace, they're interested in a much more simplified understanding of you know, where they are, how they evaluate their building or buildings. So how do we move then into something where communications become more streamlined and simplified? And does the kind of rating system that you're helping to deploy address some of those issues?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Stan. So absolutely, and yes, what Building for Help has done is we've started with, I think, what is, from my perspective as a physician, the core metric, which is health. But what's exciting is starting with health and looking at the compounds and the thermal conditions that affect the human body, gases, particles, and moving outward to say, okay, what are the levels and what are the interactive levels that impact health? We have actually created a health impact rating that assesses the standard. It creates a standard for health in buildings. And I think it's absolutely essential to be, I think it's an essential rating. And it's, even though the underlying science, it's really based for me on 25 years of research in this area, from a patient perspective and from a biological and chemistry perspective. So it has a very complicated underpinnings, but what we have is a single number which you can identify and know, are you in the green or are you not in the green? And if you're not in the green, what are some flexible, I mean, we're all saying so much of the same message. What are some flexible and affordable and appropriate remediations for buildings with certain building envelopes, construction materials, climatic zones? It's almost like an organism. It's almost like the human body. If you're going to run a marathon in the Rocky Mountains, your body's going to be is going to have different physiological demands than if you're, eating pizza and drinking beer and watching the TV. And so how do you create that sort of flexibility in, I mean, that's a simplistic metaphor, but we need to create that flexibility in our buildings. And so that's what we do. We have this rating that gives you visibility, and to use a line that I bet we all have used, if you don't measure it, you can't fix it. So we create that visibility.
Excellent.
Hey, Stan, can I just jump in? Because I think that beyond what Stephanie said, which I fully agree with, it's interesting. In Tom's question, which I may have accidentally deleted, so sorry about that. But he asked, he made this point, people want to know, is my building safe? And then how can we answer that? There's this kind of, I think, and it's not intentional or malicious, but the terms safe and healthy are kind of used interchangeably when I think they're a little bit different. And then there's kind of two lenses that you can put on each of those, one of which is the building safe itself, and then are the occupants safe or healthy? And those things are linked but kind of different. And I think that we have to be more precise in terms of and I don't know, this is coming from, probably there needs to come from regulators and standards bodies and whatever, but we need to be clear about what those terms mean. And I take safe to mean, people getting sick or infected. That is a very, it's disease avoidance and infection control. Whereas healthy is healthy, especially as the term has become more popularized with, Joe Allen and John McComer's Healthy Buildings book, and this is getting into more of the mainstream. It's more, things like performance, productivity, others, and other health things that go beyond just getting sick or not. So cognition. So it's and what Tom's question highlights is what people care about now. Is the building safe? And people can't answer that question, one, because they don't know, and number two, there's not even a consensus view of what that means. And I think that's where government and others need to step in, because that vacuum is creating a lot of problems and confusion right now.
Great comments. This panel could go on forever, but unfortunately it has only 6 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the future casting question and ask each of you to take 1 minute and just go around the horn. Projecting out 5 years, what's going to be standard operating procedures for indoor air quality in buildings? Where are we 5 years from now? And I'll let Ron start first because he's on the top of my screen.
Sure. I think the technologies, new standards, procedures, all gonna push for a couple things. More transparency and easier tools to find suitable remediation for different buildings and spaces. That's certainly something that we are seeing from our clients, because nobody wants just more data. Nobody wants to have multiple buttons to push to get to the solution. So, some of it is unrealistic, some of it is realistic. When we talk about 5 years, I think that's where we are going to. We're going to look for data transparency, information imbalance disappearing between different kind of stakeholders, and easier tools to get to the solution that the buildings need.
Great, very succinct. Stephanie, you're next.
So that's fantastic, Ron. And I'm also glad, Stan, that you didn't say 10 years like Erik did, because you can see from my gray hair, I can't think in increments of 10 years. And besides, I want this improvement to come now. And one of the things that COVID has done is put this issue on the table. But I think a standard operating procedure hopefully will be, but I think it should be, is visibility into the health impact. And so that's why I'm working on this monitoring system. And I see it almost as like a scalable, the canary in the coal mine. Is the canary being the occupant? But since we can't, for a lot of litigious reasons and other data collection reasons, it's hard to monitor human beings. So I think we need the automated canary in the building that tells you, is it singing? Is it flying around and pooping on your desk like canaries should be? But I think buildings need that visibility. And that's what I'm hoping for.
Great, good answer.
Without the poop on the desk.
Without the poop, without it.
We'll take that out.
Got it. Erik, what about you?
So I'm going to give you the half glass full, half glass empty. I'll start with the half glass empty. The half glass empty, and I hope this is not the case, but 5 years from now, we could be in a very similar place to where we are today. And if you look at the pandemic experience, while I think that there have been improvements that are made, they're very uneven across the market, and some people really get it and have invested, and many have not. And if we kind of get through this experience, well, and I'm speaking largely on the health and safety side of things. So, but I think that we could, if we're not careful, miss the opportunity here to make some much needed and important reforms and changes. And so that's my cynical side. My optimistic half glass full side is that we have the burning platform right now to bring attention to this issue. And if we are able to start with kind of rules and standards, and either the ASHRAE 62.1 updated with health and safety, or some other ASHRAE document, potentially an OSHA infection control rule that starts creating coherence and focus about what we should do in standardization, then I think that will change the market dynamics. And combined with government kind of creating incentives for people to do the right thing, I think that can really move the needle. And 5 years from now, we could be in a world where we are actually, have standards that are enforced, and where you're testing buildings and monitoring them. And I think that's my hope, and that's what we should be shooting for.
Great. Well, Aaron, you're the engineer, but I should leave the comment to you that Erik's glass half full or half empty. As an engineer, I'm sure you just tell him that the glass is just twice the size that it needs to be. But you get the opportunity to put the cap on this discussion.
That's the economist's answer, not the engineer's answer. So 3 perspectives. Regulatory, I agree with Erik. I think there's going to be increased regulatory movement in this area. So I think once the big cities like New York, DC get through this push of putting through their pretty severe energy regulations, which I think is a good thing. I think Local Law 97 in New York is a great example and should be enforced brutally, and it'll make everyone run buildings better. I think there's going to be a big push on ventilation as well. I don't know what form that'll take, but I do think that the regulatory aspect of this, the public health is going to win in the end on that. From the owner side, I think you are going to see a significant bifurcation between good buildings and bad buildings. And I think that for a variety of reasons, but good landlords and then landlords who just have a building, that's going to start to make its way through leasing brokers to the point where, you know, the good tenants, they're already starting to really self-select into very specific buildings. That trend is going to continue. And I think indoor air quality is going to be a significant factor in that. Tenant experience is another one. It's not just location anymore, whether or not you have a Class A building. Okay, so if you're a developer, you know, build a building that does things for people, because I mean, I saw this at Cushman. It's starting to make its way through the leasing brokers. And then from the general public's perspective, I genuinely hope and think that everyone's just going to have a lot more understanding of what the air is like around them, whether or not it's good for them or bad for them.
This has been a fantastic discussion, very informative. Thanks, Ron, Stephanie, Erik, Aaron, for your contribution, and to our attendees, thanks very much. This session's been recorded, and if you know others who you think would benefit from hearing it, you'll get notified when it's been posted to our YouTube channel. And hope to see all of you in the next session, which is a virtual building tour of a digital twin. Thanks so much. Good day.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you for your part.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.